In this video, we'll be looking at something called ecological succession, which is a somewhat abstract topic, but it's actually not too bad. The idea essentially is this, that over time, one biological community can replace another as a result of changes in either abiotic or biotic factors. There's two types, primary and secondary succession. This will make a little bit more sense as we kind of get into what's going on here. One thing you need to understand, of course, primary means first, secondary means second. So primary is sort of the first time it goes around, and then the secondary succession is after that. Primary succession is the establishment of ultimately our what we call a climax community from what was bare rock. So one way to think about this is think about the Hawaiian Islands that are forming as a result of volcanism. And so you get new islands actually being created. There's new chunks of the big island that are being built right now as we speak as lava flows out of the volcano. And that island is going to start off as just bare rock. And the idea then is over time, you're going to get more and more plant growth that's going to establish ultimately the final climax community. In the case of large parts of the Hawaiian Islands, that might be a tropical rainforest, but you're not going to get a tropical rainforest growing on bare rock. The idea is you get some organisms, we call them pioneer species, like lichens, they can grow on the bare rock, and as they're growing, they are chemically breaking down the rock into smaller and smaller particles, which we would start to call sand or soil, and so you start to get a little bit of a soil here. Notice this is the bedrock and it remains there. And what happens to the amount of soil as we go through time? The soil gets bigger and bigger because, as you get a little bit of soil, now all of a sudden you can get not just lichens and mosses, but you can start to get small grasses. And the soil continues to build, and then you get larger and larger shrubs, and then small trees, and eventually a climax community. That's what primary succession is. It's that name for the process by which bare rock is transformed into our climax community. The first organisms that settle on the bare rock, we call them our pioneers, our pioneer species. Think of it, like in your history class, the pioneers are the first people that went across the United States from East Coast to West Coast. Well, our pioneer species are the individuals, the plants, the mosses and the lichens that establish themselves on the bare rock and really start the process to begin. And so our pioneer species, you need to know these two, are mosses and lichens. Mosses are non-vascular plants. What that means is they have no tubes for carrying water. What kind of tubes are we talking about? Do you remember those names of those tubes? How about xylem and phloem? So these mosses lack xylem and phloem. So they're plants, but because they have no xylem and phloem, they cannot grow vertically very far. So they're kind of forced to grow almost like a rug on the rock. And they're often in very moist environments for the most part. And so maybe you've seen these, if you've ever walked like along a riverbank and seen rocks that just like appear fuzzy, that's probably mosses. Now lichens are interesting. They're a symbiotic relationship. Make a note where it says symbiotic relationship. It's a mutualistic relationship. We'll talk about that later in this unit, what that means, between a fungus and an algae. So the fungus actually grows on the bare rock and supplies the algae with the essential nutrients it needs to do photosynthesis. The algae then will do the photosynthesis and produce the sugar to feed the fungus. So they work together in order to survive where plants normally can't, which is on the bare rock. As they're doing this, as they're surviving, they're going to be secreting acids that actually break the rock down into small particles of soil. And as the soil eventually gets thicker and thicker, and the organisms die and decompose, and it becomes actually like real soil, the habitat starts to become more complex. And then you can get more organisms moving in, grasses, and so forth. If you're still feeling confused about what primary succession is, hopefully this will help. We're going to walk through primary succession visually so we can see it. So what we have in these pictures is pictures from the Hawaiian Islands and where the lava is pouring into the ocean and cooling into a hard rock. And so we're actually going to start with bare rock. And so how do we go from bare rock to that climax community? Let's take a look. The first thing that we're going to get on that bare rock are our lichens. And so this is what lichen looks like. Lichen, it's not going to be growing up from the rock much at all. If you see it, especially around here, a lot of the lichen that you'll see on rocks, it looks almost like just like spray paint or just like weird marks on it. And what that is, that's that symbiotic relationship with the algae and the fungus. Some more pictures of some lichen zoomed in so you can see different colors. Lichen can also grow on bark of trees. that's a nice picture of what it might look like. And so you see this bare rock with this lichen on it. Again, it almost looks like spray paint, like someone just came along and spray painted the rock. That's the lichen. Here's a nice picture of it growing on the side of a cliff. Valleys. There's a reason why valleys tend to be, in general, very fertile places. Because what's happening on the edges of the valley and these cliffs, you have lichen that are growing on it, and they're breaking down the rock. And so every time it rains, what happens is that little bit of soil that's being produced is washing down into the valley. And so it's almost, think of it like a kind of a fertilizing effect that happens in the valleys. And so you got this lichen growing on the rock faces. Now let's take a look at the mosses. And so remember, with mosses, we're looking at essentially non-vascular plants. So you've probably seen things like this along, again, very wet places. And so you see, because they're non-vascular, they're very, very small, very tiny little non-vascular plants, these mosses. Now imagine we've had that bare rock, and you've got the mosses and lichens growing on it, and they're starting to establish just a little bit of topsoil. And eventually now we start to get our grasses growing on that. Now grasses don't need a ton of soil to work with, but they do need a little bit, right? And now here's the cool thing. I want you to kind of think about how this builds on itself. Now, because you have some fairly substantial, little plants growing, it's going to hold the topsoil in place. It's also going to trap better any kind of dust maybe that's blowing in the breeze, and it's going to be added to that soil. And as these plants die, they're going to fall and then kind of decompose into and add to the stuff, the material in the soil. And so it's going to happen now, we call it a positive feedback loop in science. It's where, one thing happens and that increases the likelihood that something else is going to happen, and that increases, and it goes around and around and around. So once this process gets going, really once it gets to this stage, things start to happen very quickly. This picture shows it quite nicely. Look at this picture here. We've got a rock. So this is bedrock. And you can see over here in the distance, we have two more low spots, just like this low spot. So imagine every time it rains, the dirt, the soil that's being produced around the bedrock is being washed into here. And now here is the soil that's actually thick enough for our small little perennial grasses to be growing, little flowering plants even. And so what's going to happen over time to this layer of soil, of course, is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker, and it's going to spread out around the margins here. They'll merge together. That's what this is showing. So we got the bedrock at the low spot, and now look, we're getting even some small trees growing there. Eventually what's going to happen to my bedrock? It's going to be completely covered. It's still down there, but now we've got, maybe a few feet of soil over it, and now we're getting, some reasonable stands of trees. So you can see, the size of the plants is increasing, and then ultimately end up with our climax community. So we start with our pioneer species, and we end with our climax community. Make a note over here. Which climax community you end up with depends on the climate. So if you're in a very wet and warm place, maybe the climax community, like on the Swan Islands, might be a tropical rainforest. Okay, maybe the climax community might be a temperate forest or a grassland. It really depends. So here's a picture of a coniferous forest. These are all pine trees. This picture actually was taken by me. And I forget, I think it was Oregon or Washington, I can't remember, but we were on a trail and I just looked over and I said, wow, this is just a classic picture of an old growth coniferous forest. Here's our climax community. Some more pictures. I didn't take these ones, but the same idea. Now that we understand how primary succession works, let's look at secondary succession. So the key here is that we already had primary succession occur. We already were at our climax community, and then some kind of major event occurs. Maybe it's a massive fire or a flood or a hurricane, tornado, landslide. Maybe humans come through and clear cut the forest. But the key part here is that you wipe out your climax community, but the soil remains. The soil remains. So we can skip a whole step in primary succession. What step would that be? I'm hoping you're realizing, well, if we're not starting with rock, we already have soil, and in fact probably thick soil, we can skip our pioneer stages. We don't need our mosses and lichens. That is that really time intense step. We can go right to our grasses and so forth because we already have the soil. But this is what it looks like. You've got an old growth forest, fire comes through and burns the entire forest, and so you're left with just a barren landscape, but the soil's still there, right? Well, what's going to happen first is you're going to get little annual plants and grasses, little perennial grasses. Now, why those? Why doesn't it go straight to just the trees growing again? Well, think about which one of these grows faster. I'm hoping you understand that obviously these ones grow much, much faster. So they spring up. Normally they're blocked out by the presence of the trees. They're sort of starved for light by those big trees, but now those big trees are gone, so they take advantage of that and they sprout up. Then over time, you get shrubs that kind of replace those. Then the slower growing trees will replace them, and eventually our old growth, we call it an old growth forest, will appear, and that will be our large trees, and it'll look like it did much before it burned. Now here's what's cool. We used to think that fire was maybe somehow bad for a forest. We would actually purposely try to prevent all little fires from happening. We now realize that fire is actually a really awesome thing for a forest. So let's imagine we have a certain number of acres of forest. Maybe this patch of forest burned, let's say, 1 year ago. Maybe this patch of forest burned 3 years ago. And maybe this patch of forest burned 2 years ago. So, imagine if none of the fires had occurred. If none of the fires occurred, then we'd have just this ecosystem with the kinds of plants and animals that we find there. But now, because we have these other regions where there's been fire, now we have more like a patchwork. So look at this picture here. In the background, you have your old growth trees, right? This is your old growth forest, your climax community. But maybe this burned just a year ago. And so you've got essentially a grassland with all the plants and animals, the birds and the insects and so forth that are going to flourish there. And maybe in this region of the forest, you have more of a shrubland. And in this part of the forest that burned 3 years ago, maybe you got more of your kind of shorter softwood trees. And so in this one area of forest, you have much more biodiversity. You have a lot more different kinds of plants and animals than you would if there was no fires at all. So fire is actually a really natural and good thing for the environment and for just kind of the biodiversity in general. We might think of it as destructive, and it is, but it's also very creative in that it creates this more diverse forest as a whole. Some more examples of secondary succession. This is clear cutting done by humans, and so you have this old growth forest, and humans come through and cut down all the trees for just the timber, the wood, and so you're left with just the soil, and you're gonna go through secondary succession there. Here's a picture right after a fire, and then you can see, 1 year later, you've got this beautiful kind of grassland with these little perennial flowers. This is an important thing that I want you to know. We mentioned this in the other video on biomes. Organisms are beautifully adapted to both biotic and abiotic factors that are present in their environment. Right? And we looked at some examples. Like this lizard is beautifully adapted. It's camouflaged to the color of the sand. It also produces uric acid paste instead of urine like we do. And so as a result, it's going to be able to consume a lot more water than us. All right, beautiful examples of camouflage I'll be showing you. There's another one. There's another one. This owl, it may not look very camouflaged, right? But look at it with its background. Yeah, so actually the colors of the feathers beautifully mimic the colors of the rock with these bird droppings on it. Yeah, can you even see the owl in that picture? It's there. Same owl that we were just looking at. Where is it? It's right here. It's looking that direction. There's his eye right there. And here's kind of a cool example. These two individuals are adapted to a very desert environment, very hot environment, and we'll call it arid environment. And these large ears you might think are just for hearing, and while they certainly would help with hearing, these large ears are actually like the radiator on your car. What the organism does is it pumps the warm blood into the ears. That heat is then dissipated to the environment. It cools the organism, and the cool blood returns. It's the same reason why with African and Asian elephants you can tell the difference just based on the size of the ear. The African elephants have much larger ears than the Asian elephants because it is hotter in Africa. And so they have to deal with that issue of cooling their bodies much more than our Asian elephants. And realize there's just no limit to the number of examples I could give you, right? Whether it's insectivorous plants and so forth, there's just, every organism is just beautifully designed, if you want to use that word, or beautifully adapted to its particular environment. Now that design or adaptation is a little bit of a double-edged sword. It means that they are able to survive and flourish beautifully in their environment. But it also means that if that habitat changes, if there's dramatic alterations or changes in that environment, all of a sudden you may not be very well suited to that new environment. So make a note on here somewhere that habitat destruction is the #1 cause of extinction, of human-caused extinction. So habitat destruction, you take a forest and you chop it down and you turn it into a cornfield. Well, the organisms that were surviving and thriving in that forest that were beautifully adapted to that, they're probably not very well adapted to living in a cornfield. And so realize that the number one cause of extinction that humans are causing, and just in general, is the change of habitat destruction. You need to know that for sure. So anyway, that's the end of this video, and I hope that was helpful. I'll see you next time.